The house was wrapped in an oppressive silence, not the calm, comforting kind, but something heavy and suffocating, like the air before a storm. I stood in the kitchen, absently slicing vegetables on the cutting board. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were anything but tangled in restless worries I couldn't shake. Outside, the moonlight spilled over the garden, casting a cold, silvery glow. It seemed peaceful, until I heard it. At first, it was just the faint creak of wood, barely noticeable. I stopped chopping and listened. Nothing, shaking my head at my own nerves. I chided myself for being jumpy and went back to slicing. But then it happened again, this time louder, heavier, more deliberate. Footsteps. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned toward the sound. The kitchen door swung open, and there he stood, Ethan. Towering, his eyes darkened, his expression intense enough to freeze my words in my throat. "Sophia," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Each syllable seemed laced with something ominous. "Do you think everything is fine?" The question sent a ripple of unease through me. I forced myself to meet his gaze and keep my voice steady. "Ethan, it's late. Why aren't you asleep?" He didn't answer, not right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his piercing stare locked on me. "Don't you see it?" he asked at last, his tone sharper now. "Don't you see what's happening in this house?" It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I set the knife down and clenched my hands together, trying to calm the tremor creeping into my body. "Ethan, if something's wrong, we can talk about it," I said cautiously. He moved closer. I instinctively stepped back, the cold edge of the countertop pressing against my spine. The faint scent of alcohol lingered in the air between us, though his eyes were unsettlingly clear. "Don't act like you don't know," he said, his voice soft but sharp, cutting through the heavy silence. "You think you can just step into our lives, take her place, and not pay the price?" His words didn't make sense, but the fear radiating through me didn't need context. My pulse raced as I tried to reason with him. "Ethan, listen," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "If you're upset, we can talk through it. Whatever it is, we can work it out." He laughed, a short, hollow sound that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. "You think you understand." His disdain was palpable, his words dripping with venom. "You think you belong here." Ethan took another step forward, closing the gap between us. The heat of his presence felt suffocating, yet his words hit even harder. And in that moment, amidst my panic, I realized I was on the edge of something far darker than I had imagined. A storm of emotions churned inside me, fear, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name, something I didn't dare to acknowledge. My eyes darted to Ethan, but I couldn't hold his gaze. I couldn't look away either. "Ethan, stop," I whispered, my voice breaking. But he didn't. His eyes burned with an intensity that sliced through me. "You don't understand anything, do you?" he murmured, his voice low and sharp. "I can't take it anymore. I've waited long enough." Before I could respond, he reached for the knife I'd just placed on the counter. Moonlight glinted off the blade, making it gleam like a warning. I froze, my breath catching in my chest as I instinctively stepped back. My eyes, though, remained locked on him. His grip on the knife was strong, his expression unyielding, marked with a chilling resolve I couldn't ignore. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his tone too calm, as if meant to steady himself. "But I won't let anyone take my family away again." His words struck me like a blow. My heart pounded as he turned and walked away, leaving me rooted in place. Cold realization coursed through me. I wasn't just a bystander in this family. I was something much more dangerous. A threat. A pawn in a game I hadn't realized I was playing. Ethan's burning stare lingered in my mind as though etched into memory, peeling away every defense I clung to. But when he disappeared, the kitchen felt unbearably empty, the sound of my right breaths filling the silence. And then, the questions crept in, clinging to me like shadows. What was I afraid of? Was it Ethan, or the unfamiliar stir of emotions deep inside, the ones I couldn't bring myself to name? Shadows lingered as I returned to the living room. The house was eerily quiet, as though nothing unusual had happened. When Nathan entered my life, I could never have imagined any of this. I thought back to that gala, the shimmering lights reflecting off a glass of wine in my hand, and the way his eyes locked with mine from across the room. He approached with the confidence of a man who always knew what he wanted. "Sophia, I have a feeling we'll be talking a lot tonight," he said, his smile disarming. And just like that, I, a young woman with an impressionable heart, fell into his enigmatic allure. Nathan was the kind of man who was hard to resist. Polished, successful, and cloaked in just enough mystery to make you want more. When he spoke of his past marriage, his voice carried a quiet pain that softened his otherwise unshakable demeanor. His ex-wife had betrayed him, he said, leaving him with only two things that mattered: his sons, Ethan and Liam. I still remembered the way he held my hand. "Sophia, I don't just want you as my wife. I want you to help me rebuild this family," he said. It felt like a promise. And I, enamored and naive, promised him in return that I would try. But life has a way of turning promises into burdens. Ethan had disliked me the moment we met. He stood atop the staircase, silent and still, watching me with a cold intensity that felt more like scrutiny than curiosity. Liam, the younger one, was quieter, harder to read, but his reserved demeanor carried a tension that left me feeling just as isolated. Nathan, the eternal optimist, assured me, "It's just a matter of time, Sophia. They'll come around." But as the days turned into weeks, I began to doubt those words. Time didn't seem to heal anything. Instead, it deepened the cracks that were already there. Nathan's work trips became more frequent, stretching from days into weeks, sometimes months. The grand house, empty and echoing, grew more cavernous in his absence. Left alone with his sons, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, cooking dinners, tidying up, and attempting small talk. But the atmosphere had changed. Ethan was always around, his presence unsettlingly constant. He lingered in corners, in the living room while I sat alone, or outside my bedroom at night. "Do you really think you belong here?" he asked me one evening, his voice calm yet razor-sharp. I didn't know how to respond. Every word from him felt like a trap, each one pulling me deeper into unease. Liam, on the other hand, was a surprise. He had always seemed the quieter, less threatening of the two. But one night, while Nathan was away, Liam appeared at my bedroom door. "Sophia," he said, his face pale, his voice trembling. "I need to tell you something. Be careful around Ethan. He's not who you think he is." Before I could ask him to explain, he shook his head and retreated into the hallway, leaving me with a cold, sinking feeling. Liam's warning replayed in my mind, though I couldn't make sense of it. When Elena, my closest friend, came to visit, I cautiously shared my anxieties about the house and Ethan's behavior. "Sophia, don't you see it?" she said, her tone sharp with concern. "The way Ethan looks at you, it's not normal." I tried to laugh it off, dismissing her words as paranoia. But in my heart, I knew she was right. I just didn't want to admit it. The days grew darker, heavier. Ethan no longer just watched me. His gaze seemed to pierce through me, as though he could read the thoughts I fought to bury. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words were cryptic, unsettling, full of riddles that left me even more unmoored. Liam, meanwhile, withdrew further into himself, avoiding both my gaze and Ethan's, his anxiety mounting with each passing day. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a guest overstaying her welcome, or worse, an intruder in a world that didn't want me there. The house, once my sanctuary, had transformed into something sinister, a meticulously designed trap, with me unwittingly at its center. Silence cloaked the rooms, not offering peace, but suffocating tension. Each day, Ethan's gaze grew sharper, his words cutting deep and leaving invisible wounds I couldn't escape. When Nathan left for a 2-day business trip, the shift in the air was palpable. That night, I sat in the living room, failing to lose myself in the pages of a novel. The soft lamp glow, typically comforting, now did little to ease the chill spreading through my chest. Then came the sound of footsteps on the staircase. I startled, looking up to see Ethan. His hair was slightly tousled, and he wore his usual casual white t-shirt and jeans. But there was something unnerving in his expression, making the air feel stifling. "You're still awake," he said, his voice low and smoky. "Yes, I couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "What about you?" "It's late." Instead of answering immediately, Ethan simply stood there, locking his piercing gaze onto me. The weight of the moment pressed down, and I realized my grip on the book had tightened painfully. "Is something wrong, Ethan?" I forced myself to ask, though I wasn't certain I wanted to hear the answer. Ethan moved closer, his steps deliberate, each one thickening the air between us. He lowered himself into the chair across from me. The small table separating us felt like a fragile barrier, as if the room itself was closing in. "I was just wondering," he began, his voice soft yet carrying a darker undertone. "Do you ever feel lonely living in this house?" The question struck me. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Ethan, I don't think that's a very appropriate question," I said, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound composed. He chuckled softly, a faint and unsettling sound that made my skin crawl. "Actually, I think it's the perfect question," he countered. His tone was calm but merciless. "Nathan's hardly here. You're left alone, trying so hard to keep everything perfect. But does anyone really care?" His words hit like a physical blow. I stood, desperate to put an end to this conversation. But Ethan rose just as quickly. "Are you running away?" he asked, his voice heavy. "Or are you afraid?" Forcing myself to meet his gaze, I asked, "Ethan, what are you trying to say?" My voice wavered, weak against the invisible barrier between us. Ethan didn't answer. He stepped closer, breaking the fragile space between us. Before I could react, he leaned forward, placing one hand lightly on my shoulder. His breath, warm and uncomfortably close, sent ripples of unease through me. "You don't have to pretend, Sophia," he said. His words lingered in the air, heavy with an intensity I couldn't comprehend. He whispered, "I see everything." I jerked back as though his touch had scorched me. "Ethan, stop," I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't move. His dark, penetrating eyes locked onto mine, freezing me in place. Then, without a word, he stepped back, retreating into himself. I couldn't tell if he'd noticed the fear in my eyes or if he was playing a game I couldn't understand. When he finally left the room, I collapsed into a chair, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. But the worst part wasn't my fear of Ethan. It was the fear of myself. That strange, unshakable sensation creeping into my thoughts. I tried to forget that night, but it was futile. Ethan became a shadow of himself in the days that followed. He rarely spoke, yet his presence lingered. I felt it everywhere, in his piercing stares, the subtle smirk on his lips, even in the fleeting moments we crossed paths. I couldn't tell if he was doing it on purpose or if my own paranoia was getting the better of me. But the sense of being watched, of being trapped, only grew stronger. It drained me completely. Liam, however, seemed more unsettled with each passing day. One evening, he found me in the kitchen where I was making tea. His eyes were rimmed with red as though he'd been crying. "Sophia," he said, his voice unsteady and urgent. "I think Ethan, there's something wrong with him. He's planning something, and I don't know what to do." "Liam, what are you talking about?" I asked, but he shook his head, gripping the counter as if it grounded him. "I can't say," he whispered. "But you have to be careful. Ethan isn't who you think he is." Liam's words left me shaken. Ethan wasn't who I thought he was. Then who was he? The questions haunted me, their weight pulling me deeper into darkness. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next, the moment that shattered everything and changed my life forever. The unease within me grew heavier as the days dragged on, a relentless shadow that refused to lift. I felt like I was constantly being watched in my own home, a place that was supposed to be my sanctuary. Ethan's presence became even more unsettling. He appeared without warning, always catching me off guard. But what terrified me the most wasn't simply that he was there. It was his eyes. Those dark, piercing eyes seemed to harbor every sinister secret I was too afraid to uncover. One night, just as I was about to go to bed, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Liam standing there. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice so low it felt like a secret meant only for me. "I need to talk to you. I can't keep this to myself anymore." With that, he stepped into the room, tension radiating off him like a storm on the verge of breaking. Ethan sank into the chair, his hands clasped tightly together, as though battling against his thoughts. His voice quivered as he finally spoke. "He's not okay, Ethan. He's changed since you came here, but it's not your fault. He's always been like this. He always wants everything to be his." I tried to stay calm, even as his words sent a chill down my spine. "Liam, what are you saying?" Liam's voice shook as he continued. "He has a way of making people do what he wants. I don't know how, but he controls everything. And now, he's trying to control you." My heart seemed to stop. His words weren't a revelation. They were a painful confirmation, a puzzle piece that fit into place and revealed something I didn't want to face. But the worst part wasn't understanding. It was realizing I had no idea how to escape this trap I now knew I was caught in. Desperate for clarity, I called Alina. She came over that evening, and we spent hours in the living room piecing things together. When I told her what Liam had said, she fell silent, her expression growing darker with every passing moment. Finally, she asked, her voice laced with suspicion, "Do you think Nathan knows about this?" "No," I said with certainty, shaking my head. "Nathan would never allow this if he knew." Elena was quiet for another moment, then turned to me with a resolute expression. "Sophia, you need to tell Nathan. You need to talk to him before this gets worse. Ethan might be more dangerous than you think." I nodded, but anxiety gripped my chest. Would Nathan believe me? Or would he dismiss my fears, convinced I was exaggerating? I didn't know, but I couldn't just stay silent. That night changed everything. Nathan came home earlier than expected. When I heard the front door open, I felt a wave of relief. I thought this was it, that everything might finally be okay. But as I came downstairs to greet him, the weight of the air around him made me stop in my tracks. Nathan stood in the doorway, his expression dark, his eyes fixed on me, and I knew nothing would be the same again. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Nathan entered, his gaze flickering between me and the staircase. His voice, low and commanding, broke the tense silence. "Ethan," he said, his tone steady but firm. "What's going on here?" I turned toward the staircase, where Ethan stood, calm and composed, his expression betraying none of the chaos swirling around us. Yet I knew Nathan had sensed something I had desperately tried to conceal. "Nothing, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice unsettlingly calm. "Just a little chat with Sophia." Nathan's eyes narrowed. "What kind of chat?" he pressed, stepping closer. "Sophia, tell me." I froze. The words were stuck in my throat, the air unbearably heavy. Ethan's piercing gaze locked onto mine, warning me, if I spoke, it would unravel everything, destroying him and dragging me down with him. "Nothing important, Nathan," I finally said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Ethan was just talking about how he feels since I arrived here." Nathan's eyes flicked between us, suspicion creeping over his face. "Feeling how?" he asked, his tone sharp. Ethan stepped down from the staircase, each step deliberate, the sound amplifying the tension in the room. "Dad," he said, his voice cool but resolute, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about this family and about Sophia." The words crashed into the room like a bombshell, leaving me reeling, breathless. What was he doing? What was he trying to achieve? I couldn't fathom his intentions, but it was clear he was steering us toward a breaking point I wasn't ready for. Nathan's focus snapped to Ethan, his face hardening. "Explain yourself," he demanded. Ethan shot him a smirk, cold, calculating, a look that made my stomach knot. You thought bringing Sophia here would fix everything, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. But you were wrong. She doesn't belong here, and I'm going to prove it. The impact of his words felt like a physical blow. I didn't know his plan, but I sensed disaster looming. Nathan turned to me, his eyes searching mine, disappointment etched deeply into his expression. Sophia, he asked, his voice heavy, is there something you're not telling me? I felt myself spiraling, the ground slipping out from beneath me. I wanted to speak, to explain, but the words remained trapped. Everything was unraveling, and I was powerless to stop it. Nathan's gaze bore into me, awaiting answers I wasn't sure I could give. Overwhelmed by doubt and disappointment, the room around me felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. Everything seemed to unravel at once. Before I could react, Ethan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the heavy silence with chilling precision. Sophia doesn't belong here, he declared, calm yet sharp. I tried to warn you, Dad, but you wouldn't listen. Bringing her here isn't fixing anything. You were wrong. Nathan turned to Ethan, confusion written across his face. Ethan, what are you saying? This isn't just about you. What are you trying to achieve? Ethan responded with a bitter laugh, devoid of warmth. I'm not trying to achieve anything, Dad. I just need you to see the truth, that we don't need her. She's going to destroy this family. His words hit me like punches I couldn't avoid, each one sharper than the last. Before I could respond, Liam's voice rang out from the hallway, trembling but steadier than I'd ever heard before. Enough, Ethan. All attention turned to Liam, who stood in the doorway, tears glistening in his eyes yet burning with resolve. Sophia hasn't done anything wrong, he said, his voice breaking but unwavering. You're the one tearing this family apart. You've manipulated all of us and turned life here into a nightmare. Ethan turned on Liam, his expression cold and dangerous. Shut up, Liam, he growled, his voice low and menacing. No, Liam replied, his voice cracking but defiant. I've been silent for too long. I've let you control me, control everything, but I won't do it anymore. I stared at Liam in disbelief, my heart pounding. This boy who had always been so quiet, so hesitant, was now standing his ground. But what came next left me reeling. Ethan doesn't just want Sophia gone, Liam said, choking on his words as tears streamed down his face. He wants to destroy everything. He told me he'd do whatever it takes to make her leave, to make Dad regret bringing her here. And I was too scared to stop him. The air in the room froze. My eyes darted to Nathan, silently pleading for him to intervene. But he stood there, motionless, trying to piece together the chaos unraveling before him. Ethan scoffed, his laugh hollow and cruel. How pathetic, he sneered. Do you really think Dad will take your side, Liam? You've always been weak, hiding behind me, and now you think you can stand against me. Enough? Nathan's voice roared through the room, reverberating off the walls. The silence that followed was deafening. He turned to Ethan, anger and pain etched on his face, before looking at me with an almost pleading expression. Sophia, Nathan said softly, is there something you haven't told me? I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt as if it had closed up, sealed by the overwhelming mess inside me. Before I could muster a response, Ethan stepped forward, his expression unnervingly calm. Don't blame her, Dad, Ethan said, his voice devoid of emotion. She's just a piece in my plan. His words froze me in place as the realization hit me. Every glance, every interaction, every moment, it had all been calculated. This was his game, one he'd orchestrated from the start. Nathan stood frozen, his face stricken with shock. Ethan, what are you talking about? Ethan's gaze didn't falter. Nothing, he said softly, almost cruelly. I just wanted to remind you of one thing. No one can replace Mom. And deep down, you've always known that. Then, without another word, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving an unbearable silence in his wake. Nathan stood rooted to the spot, staring after him, Hurt and disbelief etched on his face. Liam was motionless, tears spilling freely. As for me, I felt empty, as though everything I had hoped for was gone. By morning, I was gone too. No goodbyes, no explanations, just a hollow ache. Walking out the door, I knew I wasn't just leaving the house. I was leaving behind a part of myself I'd never get back. And as I glanced back one last time, a chilling thought crept into my mind. None of us had truly escaped Ethan's game. We had all been pawns, playing roles we didn't understand until it was too late.